Chapter 1. The Sentence Beneath the Red Sky. By the time they brought her to the execution yard, the war had already ended everywhere except inside the hearts of those who had survived it. Badly, the sky above Fort Resolute burned with the deep iron red of Martian dusk, and the wind dragged powdered rust across the yard in thin hissing sheets that gathered in the corners of blast walls and around the boots of the soldiers assigned to witness one last legal death before the garrison returned to ordinary discipline. There was a script for this sort of thing. There was always a script when states wished to make killing feel cleaner than murder. The condemned was to be identified, the charges read, the chain of command affirmed, the final refusal of clemency noted, and then the sentence, already old in everyone's files before the prisoner even reached the yard, would be carried out with the solemn efficiency of civilization pretending it had no taste for blood, yet no amount of protocol could entirely smooth the ugliness from what stood at the center of the yard that evening, a young alien woman in restraint irons, bruised thin from months of confinement and so visibly out of place beneath the hard geometry of a human military base that several newer recruits found themselves unable to look at her directly for very long. Her name was Sale of House Vera, though the legal file pinned to the execution authorization slab called her Subject 7KS. Surviving hostile noble asset confirmed. Kinline relation to Archon Vera of the Surthai Dominion. The humans had a way of doing that in wartime, especially after catastrophic loss. Names blurred first, then titles, then personhood, until someone could be reduced to relation, utility, category, and threat index. 2. The public, what remained of the Shrey after the war, were symbols of betrayal and atrocity, the beautiful, silver-blooded empire that had smiled through treaties while seeding plagues in human agricultural domes and burning evacuation routes around Luna's outer civilian ring. Human children had died in vacuum because of Seraphi admirals. Whole Marine battalions had been cooked alive in the glassing of Telm Reach because Shrey diplomats lied for 6 straight negotiation cycles while their fleets moved into strike geometry. War had ended with human victory and Seri collapse, but victory had not come with cleanliness, and unclean victories leave many people hungry for a shape they can call justice. Sil had become that shape. It was not because she had led armies or signed extermination orders. She had done neither. When the war began, she was 17 standard years old and living inside the perfumed ceremonial cage of the Sari High Court. Taught languages, lineage law, strategic etiquette, and the old songs of dynastic continuity. When the war ended, she was 20, the last living daughter of a house whose name had become poison in every human hearing chamber from Earth to the belt. Her father had died during the fall of the Sari Crown habitat. Her brothers in separate fleet actions. Her mother either in the collapse or afterward in flight. Reports varied. Sale herself had been found half-conscious inside an emergency archive vault beneath the ruins of the palace station. Not armed, not resisting, only kneeling beside 2 dead child attendants and clutching a seal cylinder containing dynastic records no one in the human assault teams bothered to preserve once they saw the crest burned into it. Under ordinary post-war law, she might have become a protected detainee, political witness, bargaining relic, or forgotten prisoner among thousands, but history is rarely governed by ordinary law in the first months after it has been set on fire. The hearings that followed her capture were swift, furious, and very public. Prosecutors argued that leaving any Vera alive would encourage mythic restoration among surviving loyalists. Commentators called her the jeweled daughter of massacre. Families of the dead demanded symbols that breathed. She had been sentenced not because the evidence tied her directly to battlefield crimes, but because a grieving civilization decided that bloodline itself had become part of the crime. There were officers on Mars who disliked that. Few said so loudly. Commander Elias Ward was one of the few who had stopped sleeping well the day the transfer order crossed his desk. He had served the war from the beginning, first as a line captain during the Juno corridor disasters, then as ground command in the brutal station retakings above Neptune, and finally as acting provost overseer during the chaotic prisoner and refugee sorting that followed the collapse of the Sri Corps worlds. He had seen enough genuine monsters to develop little patience for theatrical pity. Men and women who gassed hospitals, rigged orphan shelters with delayed charges, vented colony domes, and smiled in negotiation after ordering all of it. Those existed, and he had watched some of them die without once feeling his conscience stir. Yet Sale troubled him in ways he could not dismiss as sentimentality. He had reviewed the case files 3 times. He knew the political pressure around them. He understood the argument that empires often leave dangerous seeds in their surviving dynasties. Still, every time he read the record, he ran into the same wall. There was no proof she had ordered, killed, planned, or even meaningfully aided the crimes for which her blood was being symbolically punished. She was, in the logic of the sentence, guilty of being the last polished face still available for a civilization's rage. He watched her brought in under guard while the wind scraped red dust in circles around the execution posts, and felt that old war instinct, the one that had kept him alive in battle, rise now for a stranger. In war it warns of mines, snipers, silence that means ambush. In peace, when one has not killed off the better parts of oneself entirely, it warns of moral traps dressed as duty. Fort Resolute's adjutant, Major Sarin Holt, stood beside him, reading down the final sequence checklist with brisk professionalism. Hall was not cruel. That made him more dangerous in moments like this, because he truly believed systems were at their most righteous when individuals stopped interfering with the hard necessities of collective order. All witnesses present, Holt said. Command authorization confirmed. Execution team ready. Elias kept his eyes on Sale. Her silver blue skin carried the faint opaline sheen of the Seraphy under artificial light, though hunger and confinement had dulled it. Her hair had been cut badly at the prison infirmary to treat a cranial wound months earlier, and had grown back in uneven dark white lengths around her face. She did not look regal now. She looked young, exhausted, afraid, in the very controlled way of someone who has long since learned that fear displayed openly becomes a pleasure for others. Has she asked for anything? Elias said. Hall glanced at his slate. Water refused. Sedation requested that the body not be displayed after sentence. He paused. Request denied. Elias turned then. On what grounds? Public consequence review. Of course the war was over, and yet people still needed a theater from it. The chaplain assigned to final witness. Wrights was an old woman from the Europa catacomb, severe and compassionate, equal measure, who administered to human dead and enemy prisoners alike. Through 3 campaigns, she approached Sale with a canteen and a strip of clean cloth to wipe the dust from her mouth. The nearest guard moved to stop her out of reflex, and Elia's voice cut across the yard before he fully decided to speak. Let her through. No one argued. The chaplain held the canteen to Sale's lips because the prison cuffs fixed her hands too low to manage it herself. For the first time that evening, Sale lifted her eyes fully. They were not the inhuman jewel lamps so often described in anti-Sci-Fi war propaganda. They were eyes like anyone's after too many nights without hope, bright only because the body has not yet decided whether surrendering to despair might conserve energy. Do you understand the sentence? The chaplain asked softly. Sale's translator, caller old and slightly out of sync from repeated reprogramming, rendered her answer with a faint, mechanical delay. Yes. Do you wish to say anything before it is carried out? Most condemned say something then. Protest, curse, prayer, a last joke of courage or shock has been that way. Sale looked past the chaplain toward the red horizon where the last daylight bled against the wall towers, and when she spoke, her voice came almost too quiet for the caller to catch. I was taught that humans were animals who loved vengeance more than memory, she said. A few of the witnesses stirred. Angrily, the chaplain stayed still. Then I met prisoners, Sale continued, and refugees and soldiers carrying their dead. I learned you love memory so much that vengeance grows out of it like a wound. She swallowed once. I understand why you hate us. I do not understand why that has to end here. The translator made the final sentence cold and exact. No one in the yard liked hearing it. Major Holt stepped forward, at once as if language itself had become contamination. The sentence was lawfully adjudicated under emergency war continuity statutes. He said, this is not a debate. Sale actually looked at him, then, which took more courage than any speech would have. No, she said, it is a choice. And there in the rust-red dusk, with the firing team shifting into final posture and the witnesses arranged in state-approved half-circle, the universe narrowed down to one unbearable point. Around Commander Elias Ward, he had followed orders for 21 years. He had sent men into rooms they would not leave. He had signed assault timings that killed civilians because the alternative was allowing greater slaughter. 3 decks deeper, he had watched war turn law into triage and triage into grief. He understood discipline. He understood the arrogance of officers who think their conscience outranks the structure around them. But he also understood something Hall never would, that the difference between order and atrocity often arise not as a clear philosophical crisis, but as one deeply inconvenient person placed directly in front of you at the exact hour everyone else would prefer you stop noticing details. S was not innocent in the clean, impossible sense, no child of a court. That monstrous comes through history unstained. She had likely known things, benefited from things, stood too long inside rooms where the suffering of others was abstracted into policy. Yet none of that changed the core truth now, glaring like a knife in his mind. This execution was not justice, it was convenience wearing a legal mask. The firing team raised rifles. Major Holt began the formal last call, and Commander Elias Ward, against every instinct that had preserved his career, his rank, and his safety until now, stepped forward and said the words that would shock not just the Yard, not just the base, but half the civilized systems. Once they learned what he had done. "Stand down," he said. For one full second no one moved, because some orders sound so impossible, the body refuses them before the mind catches up. Then Holt turned, stunned fury already climbing into his voice. Commander Elias did not look at him, he looked at the rifles, the chaplain, the condemned girl, the witnesses, the red dust, the whole machinery of righteous killing, assembled around one politically useful death. I said, "Stand down," the rifles lowered halfway by training reflex. Every future that followed, court martial, scandal, mutiny, rumors, political collapse, and the thing far stranger than all of those began there, with one man choosing disobedience in front of an empire that had convinced itself the execution of a defeated enemy. Girl was the final necessary act of healing. The universe, it would later be said, was not shocked that Elias Ward spared her. It was shocked by what happened after he did. Chapter 2. The man who broke the script. The first sound after Elias gave the order was not protest, but the wind scraping dust and thin red lines over the execution stones, while everyone present waited for reality to decide whether it had genuinely shifted or merely glitched for a breath. Then Major Saren Holt snapped back into motion with the offended speed of a man who believes authority once contradicted must instantly become louder to remain real. "Commander, you are countermanding a lawful sentence under ratified military tribunal." Elias cut him off without raising his voice. "I am suspending an unlawful use of a lawful framework pending command review." Holt stared, then barked a laugh from sheer disbelief. "You don't have that authority." Elias finally turned to face him. "I have provisional command authority over all terminal enforcement actions at this facility until handoff to higher sector civil review. Read the transfer annex you've been quoting at me all week." He had read it 3 times the night before while hating himself for looking so hard for a lever. There it was, buried in administrative language, meant mostly for equipment delays and prisoner identity discrepancies. The local commander retained emergency discretion if material, ethical, or evidentiary irregularity emerged prior to execution. No one had expected anyone to use it against political momentum. That did not make it less real. Holt knew the clause now too. One could see it in the momentary fracture behind his anger. "This is not an evidentiary irregularity," he said. "This is sentiment." Elias stepped closer. "No," he said, "it's command judgment." Around them, the witnesses had begun to shift, first in confusion, then in something more dangerous, as they understood this was no temporary delay, but an actual contest over whether the state was going to kill the girl tonight. One of the bereaved civilian representatives swore under her breath. A junior Marine on the firing line lowered his rifle fully and kept his eyes fixed on the dust at his boots, as if refusing to be seen. Choosing, the chaplain, still beside Sale, said nothing at all, but the slightest exhale escaped her like a prayer too small to survive public ownership. Protocol once broken becomes a battlefield. Holt reached for his slate to trigger immediate high command arbitration and likely armed override. Elias had expected that, though. Expecting did little to ease the violence of what he did next. He took the slate from Holt's hand and shut it down physically against the edge of the execution rail hard enough to splinter. The screen, gasps moved through the yard. In a visible wave. Officers can argue. Law, destroying the tool of escalation, makes the conflict suddenly primitive. Again, you just destroyed tribunal property, Holt said, voice gone thin. With outrage, Elias almost smiled at the absurd smallness of the charge beside. The thing they had nearly done, added to the report, he said, after you helped me move the prisoner back inside. That was the moment the witnesses truly understood he meant to save her. Chaos did not erupt all at once, it leaked in. Through human channels, civilian observers demanding explanation. Two-line officers arguing over custody. Chain security personnel waiting for a use of force threshold no one wanted to define. First, someone in the outer control room had already flagged the halt to internal command. So the Basecomnet began filling with clipped priority requests and increasingly panic requests for authority. Clarification: Fort Resolute had been built to withstand bombardment, not moral ambiguity, and like most human systems under strain, it proved much less stable in the second category. Elias used that instability ruthlessly. He ordered sale return to secure medical hold under his direct seal. He reassigned the firing team to perimeter lockdown because idle armed personnel in confused political moments become stupid. Fast, he directed the chaplain and med staff to accompany the prisoner under witness. Most importantly, he triggered full visual record preservation on every feed in the yard before someone higher up could sanitize the scene into a simpler story. Sale herself seemed almost the least shocked person there. Not calm exactly, her face had gone pale, even beneath skin tones, and the fine tremor in her shoulders told its own truth, but she was not behaving like a woman suddenly convinced she had been saved. She was behaving like one who had stepped from certainty into a more complicated species of danger. When the guards moved to turn her toward the inner holding blocks, she resisted just enough to look back at Elias. Why, she asked. The translator caller flattened the word, but not the rawness beneath it. There were 1,000 answers available to him, and none fit cleanly. Because the law was being abused. Because your death would mean nothing except satisfying exhausted rage. Because I'm tired of pretending every ugly necessity is still necessity. Because my brother died on Tel Reach, and I know exactly what it feels like to want to face any face to pay. In the end, he gave the one answer honest enough to live in the room. Because if I let this happen, he said, then I know what kind of man I become tomorrow. She held his gaze for one fraction too long, and something unreadable passed through her expression. Shock, perhaps, or the first dangerous outline of hope. Then the guards moved her inside. By midnight, Mars Standard, the story had escaped the base. There was never any real chance it would not. Too many witnesses, too many internal feeds, too much political interest already coiled around the scheduled execution. The first leaks on public channels were ugly, fragmented, and immediately weaponized by every faction with a pulse. Human commander halts war criminal sentence. Vieira princess spared by unknown internal influence. Mutiny at Fort Resolute. By dawn, 23 news grids had attached old footage of Sale's ruined home world. recycled images of Sri atrocities, and interviews with family members of the war dead who felt sincerely, grievously, understandably that the dead had just been betrayed. Other voices appeared just as quickly, legal scholars, noting the tribunal's thin evidence, veteran officers calling bloodline execution a stain on the victory, friend, political groups claiming Elias had uncovered a hidden truth so vast the state would now bury him for it. The machine of public meaning once fed ran far ahead of facts. High command moved with its usual mixture of panic and arrogance. At 4:11 a.m., sealed order arrived, removing Elias from immediate operational authority, pending investigation. At 4:13 a.m., second order countermanded the first because the inquiry board was still debating whether acting too fast might look like retaliation for lawful command. Discretion. At 502, the defense secretariat dispatched a crisis team to Mars. At 6:40, the president's office requested a private summary with the sort of phrasing that means, tell me whether this can still be contained before I decide which principle I currently believe in. Elias read all of it from the command desk outside Med. Hold 3 while drinking coffee gone cold twice and watching the red planet wake slowly through armored viewport. Glass behind the sealed door. Sale underwent a full medical reassessment for the first time since her capture. 3 untreated fractures, nutritional depletion, old burns, a recurring neural stress condition left improperly managed. In custody, when the med chief handed Elias the report, she said only, if you had waited another week she might have died before any execution order mattered. He did not know whether that made his choice easier or far worse. He was granted one private interview before the inquiry team arrived. The room they gave him was an old observation chamber, converted into overflow secure council space, half clinical white, half Martian, morning through narrow armored windows. Sale sat on the far side of the table in fresh gray detainee linen with medical patches visible at her neck and wrist. Without the execution restraints and red dust, she looked even younger, though the war had left a kind of disciplined age in her posture impossible to mistake for innocence. 2 guards waited outside the door. The recorder orb glowed between them for several seconds. Neither spoke. Elias had imagined this moment through the sleepless dark and found now that it existed. That imagination had failed entirely. He was not interrogating a monster, nor rescuing a princess, nor conferring with some hidden mastermind whose secret knowledge would justify all the ruin now rolling outward from his choice. He was sitting across from a frightened, damaged young woman who had almost been killed to simplify history, I suppose. Sale said at last, voice dry from healing gel, this is where you ask whether I am grateful. Elias leaned back and let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. No, he said, this is where I ask whether sparing you is going to get more people killed. That made her blink once, sharply, as though the honesty had landed harder than accusation might have. If I wanted your people dead, she said after a moment, I would have accepted the execution. My death would have fed every surviving loyalist story about human fear and blood hatred. Martyrs are useful things to collapsing empires. The answer was too intelligent to be comforting. Elias folded his hands. Then help me understand why half the inner world think I just saved a war Criminal S's mouth tightened, because it is easier for victors to bury dynasty than to sort which members were guilty, which were complicit, and which were simply born too near monsters. He did not like how quickly he believed she believed that the next 2 hours changed the shape of the case, the war's legacy, and eventually the galaxy's understanding of both. Syl did not weep or beg. She did something more dangerous, she explained. Not everything, not at once, but enough. She described the final year of the Sari court from the inside, not as a throne of omnipotent cruelty, but as a collapsing system devouring itself while projecting aristocratic certainty outward. Factional killings sealed archives. Children raised as dynastic collateral rather than trusted heirs. Her father's terror of human retaliation after Telmer reach, her mother's private efforts to smuggle out prisoner lists through cultural channels. Once the worst atrocities began, the archive vault under the palace station, where she had not been hiding precious jewels or tactical codes, but a continuity record containing evidence that several high-ranking Sari ministers already dead by the war's end had fabricated or exaggerated dynastic authorizations to push extermination policies faster than the crown itself could publicly absorb. It was not exoneration, nothing so clean. Sale had still belonged to that world, benefited from it, failed to stop horrors. She understood too late and too little. But by the time she finished, Ilias knew with absolute certainty that if the state had executed her on schedule, it would have destroyed not only a human conscience, but also the one living witness capable of proving that large parts of the war's official narrative had been politically tidied at the expense of truth. When the inquiry team arrived from Earth, they expected to manage a scandal. Instead, they found a commander prepared to ruin careers. Prisoner 2, informed to disappear quietly anymore in a case that had ceased to be about one spared execution and become something much larger. Whether humanity, fresh from victory, would choose honest justice or keep feeding itself the simpler poison of revenge, the universe had not yet noticed. It would soon, because the thing Ilias Ward had really saved that evening in the execution yard was not merely Sale's life, it was the possibility that the victorious might still bear to hear an inconvenient truth from the daughter of their enemy. Chapter 3. The truth hidden in the last daughter. The first hearing was supposed to bury the matter. That was clear from the room before anyone spoke. They held it not in an open tribunal hall, but in a hardened review chamber 3 levels beneath Fort Resolute, one of those sterile military spaces designed to make every statement sound temporary and every moral issue feel like a logistics problem if one used enough gray furniture and enough soft soundproofing. The panel included a Defense Secretariat legal director, war crimes prosecutor, a Senate oversight liaison, 2 admirals rotated in for authority optics, and 1 civilian ethicist added so late and so transparently for balance that even the junior record clerks looked embarrassed. On paper, the purpose of the hearing was narrow, assess Commander Ilias Ward's obstruction of a lawful military sentence and determine whether the detainee Sale Vera still represented an active strategic danger requiring renewed terminal action. In reality, everyone in the room knew they were there to answer a much larger question without naming it too directly. Had humanity, at the exact moment it most Wanted closure, nearly executed the one. Witness capable of proving its own. Post-war settlement was built on incomplete truths. The first hours did not go well for the state. Elias, exhausted enough that honesty had become easier than caution, gave testimony with the precise fury of a man who has already accepted that his career may not survive and therefore feels liberated from pretending institutions deserve graceful handling when they are caught with blood on their teeth. He did not romanticize Sale. He described her lineage, her likely proximity to the court, her possible complicity through silence and privilege. Then he described the tribunal record that sentenced her, the missing evidentiary chain, the political pressure statements, the broad use of bloodline liability where direct culpability failed, the refusal to permit independent archive review, the denied medical petitions, the public consequence request attached to her corpse. By the time he finished, one of the admirals was no longer looking at him but at the legal director beside him, as if calculating how many signatures had been placed under the word justice with fingers that knew exactly what they were covering. Sal's testimony made the chamber worse. The public later imagined she delivered it like a queen restored by fate, cold and brilliant and morally devastating. Every line. The truth was more difficult, and therefore more human. She entered under guard, visibly thinner than she should have been, translating old trauma into poise, because poise was one of the few serrae disciplines the war had not managed to beat out of her. Her voice wavered twice in the first 6 minutes. She asked for water once and apologized afterward, which made the civilian ethicist close her eyes in visible pain. Yet the substance of what she said cut through the room with the ugly power of records that were never meant to survive. The Sri war machine, she explained, had not been a perfectly unified command of collective species hatred, as human post-war narratives preferred to claim. It had been a regime collapsing inward under its own militarist propaganda cast and panic at losing control. Her father had signed monstrous orders. Yes, so had the crown ministries, but many of the most public extermination directives, including 2 used heavily in post-war human memorial media, had been altered or fabricated in final archive release by a war faction that wanted the dynasty irredeemably damned, so no negotiated surrender could ever emerge. When the human assault closed in, these same factions destroyed moderates, purged witnesses, and left surviving noble kin, including Sale, to function as clean symbolic residue. This did not make the Sarafi innocent. That distinction had to be fought for in the chamber, because several on the panel, hearing the complexity of the truth, immediately reached for the comforting. Binary humans always prefer, after surviving atrocity, either the enemy was purely monstrous and therefore simple to punish, or any complication meant dangerous relativism. Sale resisted that trap with surprising clarity. I am not asking you to love us, she said. I am telling you that you nearly killed me to preserve a version of events that is easier to live with than the real one. The real one is that our empire rotted from inside, and then you helped yourselves heal by making all surviving blood equally convenient. That sentence hung in the room like a knife, too valuable to throw away and too sharp to hold comfortably. One of the admirals muttered convenient under his breath, as though the word itself had exposed more than he wanted to know about the machinery he served, then Sale produced. The archive key, it had been found sewn into the lining of an old ceremony undergarment taken from her at capture and left unexamined in a storage lot, because the victorious are often lazy with the details of their enemies dead. Customs, the key itself looked unimpressive, a translucent bone white sliver no longer than a human finger, until her forensic escort linked it to the chamber projector and the room filled with the final court records of a dying empire. Not summaries, not edited. Intelligence extracts, raw succession. Logs, emergency council transcripts. Hidden directives, assassination orders. Argument fragments, terrified private. Memoranda, and the personal sealed note of Sale's mother, Lady Aria Vera, addressed to no one specific end. Everyone who might survive. In it she described the war faction's seizure of command, the fabricated directives attributed to dead relatives, and her failed attempt to get her daughter and several child attendants off-world through a humanitarian archive convoy. Before the palace fell, she ended with a line the chamber clerk later had to stop reading aloud because even trained professionals started crying in the silence afterward. If my daughter lives, do not mistake her survival for endorsement of our crimes. In that court, surviving was only another form of being used. Human governments hate documents like that because they ruined the efficiency of mourning. News of the archive leak did not stay contained. Of course, nothing that large ever does, no matter how desperately states want one clean week of private processing before publics begin tearing at the seams. By the second day, network commentators were already at war over what it meant. Some claimed Sale's evidence vindicated the decision to spare her and condemned the tribunal as post-war blood theater. Others argued that the broad truth of Syria atrocity remained untouched and that emphasizing internal complexity risked insulting the dead by complicating the story at the exact moment. Memory should remain sharp. Veterans split, historians sharpen knives. Families of those lost at Telmer, Reach, and Luna's outer civilian ring spoke from the wound outward and often refused to care whether the daughter of House Vera had signed orders or merely eaten beneath the roof where they were planned. All of that was human and understandable and terrible, yet beneath it another realization spread more quietly through Syria's circles. Elias Ward had not simply saved one life. He had prevented the Republic from anchoring its whole moral memory of the war to a symbolic execution that would later have been exposed as a grotesque convenience. The Defense Secretariat tried to pivot. An internal memo leaked within the week proposed reclassifying Sale from condemned war adjacent noble prisoner to protected evidentiary detainee under extraordinary historical review, which was bureaucratic language, for we would very much like credit for not killing the witness we were about to shoot at dusk. The attempt failed publicly because Elias, who by then had decided he was too far inside the disaster to preserve anyone's vanity, testified again and released the execution yard preservation feed himself. Through counsel, the galaxy saw Sale and Irons. The firing team holds shattered. Slate. Elias stepping forward. The order to stand down. Human opinion already unstable shifted violently again. There is one thing even exhausted post-war societies hate more than complexity. It is discovering they were encouraged to commit a symbolic atrocity because complexity was politically inconvenient. Sale became against her will and taste one of the most dangerous people alive, not because she commanded fleets or surviving Seri loyalists, but because she stood at the fault line between grief and truth. Many wanted her dead, still for revenge, for closure, for fear that if she continued speaking, history itself would become harder to carry. Others wanted to make her a saint of reconciliation, which she despised even more because saints are usually just politically useful victims with better lighting. Elias understood this before most. He moved from open command, disgrace, into something stranger. Protective custodian with no clean legal title. High command could not arrest him without making martyrdom look too obvious. They could not restore him fully without admitting too much, so he remained in a gray zone, attached to the review process, sleeping 4 hours a night, carrying a sidearm more out of habit than actual utility, and accompanying Sale between hearings and archive sessions because every intelligence branch in civilized space now wanted what she knew or wanted to stop what she might yet say. Their private conversations during those weeks were not romantic, not easy, and not especially kind. He asked questions too sharply. She answered, sometimes with court-bred contempt. He had to remind himself was armor, not superiority. He accused her once of waiting too long to resist. She replied with equal brutality that he had only just discovered what his civilization looked like to its enemies when it became hungry for examples, yet slowly through argument and testimony and the strange intimacy of surviving public hatred from opposite sides of the same war, something else grew there. Not trust in the foolish, simple sense, recognition. Each knew the other had stepped across a line from which their own people might never fully welcome them back. Each knew that saving truth is sometimes indistinguishable too. The world watching from betrayal, and beyond them, the universe began paying attention, not to romance, not yet, or not in the childish way later songs would pretend. What shocked the civilized systems first was the precedent. A human commander had defied his own state to stop the execution of a dynastic enemy woman, then uncovered evidence proving the victorious had nearly murdered history itself for convenience. Powers that despised Earth saw weakness in it. Smaller worlds saw for the first time that even humanity, so often terrifying in collective wrath, contained officers willing to stand in front of the gun barrel of public rage. If law had begun to rot, the old empire saw something else and feared it more. If one act of conscience could fracture the neat moral settlement of a major war, what else inside their own victories might be one disobedient witness away from collapse? That was the point at which the matter stopped being a domestic scandal. It became galactic. And that is why when the assassination attempt came, it did not come from one direction. It came from the whole old universe at once. Chapter 4: The Choice that changed more than a life. The assassination attempt failed for the same reason the execution had. One person in the room noticed the moral geometry before everyone else finished, pretending it was still simple. The hearing chamber above New Geneva was supposed to be secure. The phrase meant very little by then because every serious intelligence service in civilized space had already tried probing its walls through contractors, hacked maintenance bids, legal courier substitutions, and 2 bribed archive clerks who later vanished from all visible systems. Sale's evidence had metastasized far beyond the original war. Crimes Review, now it touched Reconstruction claims, memorial, doctrine, treaty legitimacy, and the dangerous public understanding that a victorious species can still lie to itself about why it kills. There were governments, corporations, surviving Serafi loyalists, Beriev political factions, and several patriotic human networks, all united by one unlikely common goal. Sale had to disappear before the Archive Review moved into final publication. If they could not turn her back into a villain, they could at least turn her into a corpse and let history blur the rest around loss and confusion. Elias saw the courier first, not because he was the best security mind in the building, though by then he had become unpleasantly good at detecting where death wanted to stand. He saw him because everyone else in the chamber was still watching the witness feeds and the old archive overlays, while the crier moved with just enough hesitation to suggest he was navigating a room he had studied but never inhabited. The med satchel was authentic, the badge too, but grief had sharpened Elias into a particular species of animal by then, one that noticed tiny wrongness before conscious logic translated it. The courier's eyes did not once flick toward the wounded witness stand where a real medtech would have looked first. They went instead to the side entrance nearest Sale's escort corridor. Elias was moving before that man's hand reached fully inside the satchel. The shot killed the glass wall behind Sale and nearly took the Senate liaison's throat. Security fired late, because security always fires late when politics has spent weeks teaching everyone that visible force is the scandal rather than the need for it. Elias hit Sale hard enough to drive them both beneath the evidence table as the room exploded into shrieks, smoke, and the black ugly sound of a smart fleshed weapon inside a legal chamber. He remembered absurd details afterward, the sting of shattered glass in his mouth, the weight of Sale's shoulder under his arm, the way the evidence projector kept scrolling old Sri transcripts into the smoke as though history itself refused to stop just because the living had once again failed it. The assassin died, then another appeared in the corridor, then a third dressed as local security. By the time it ended, 6 people were dead, 2 of them there explicitly to protect Sale, and the whole illusion that the matter could still be handled as a difficult legal curiosity had burned away. The president addressed the public. That night she did not use poetic language. Earth's leaders never do when things have become too ugly for style. She said there had been an organized attempt to murder a protected witness under federal review. She said the archive findings regarding the late war would proceed without alteration. She said Commander Elias Ward had acted with extraordinary moral and operational courage under hostile institutional pressure, which was the nearest a sitting administration had yet come to admitting the execution stoppage should never have needed to happen. And then she said something that rippled far beyond Earth's own worlds. Justice is not weakened by discovering the truth, was larger than our grief could comfortably hold. Justice is weakened only when we kill the truth to protect our pride. That sentence did what dozens of hearings had struggled to do. It reframed the matter not as whether Sale Vera deserved life because she was secretly pure. She was not, and no serious person claimed otherwise, but whether civilized societies deserve to call themselves civilized if they executed complexity every time. Complexity embarrassed the victory story once that pivot entered public consciousness, the old demand for her death began to lose ground, not vanish. Never that, there remained too many graves and too many human families for clean forgiveness to become fashionable. But anger is not the same thing as appetite for wrongful killing, and large numbers of people who had initially wanted Sale dead now found themselves wanting something harsher and more adult from history instead, the full truth. Even if it hurt everyone, the final ruling came 4 months later. Salva was not declared innocent. That would have been another lie, just in the opposite direction. The review court found her complicit by inherited status and sheltered proximity, but not legally culpable for the direct atrocity chain that had justified her death sentence. The original tribunal was condemned as politically contaminated and materially unsound. The Republic issued a formal censure of the execution order, sealed the bloodline liability doctrine under emergency repeal, and created the VA standard and evidentiary rule requiring direct culpability thresholds in all future post-war prosecutions involving dynastic survivors. Scholars would later argue that this mattered more than 3 fleet treaties. Entire generations would be spared symbolic death because one commander on Mars refused to let a firing squad close around a convenient body. As for Elias, the universe still did not quite know what to do with him. He was too valuable to discard, too disobedient to reward cleanly, and too publicly vindicated to destroy without national shame. In the end, he was offered what political systems always offer men who embarrass them righteously: honorable reassignment, advisory command, institutional distance. With polite medals attached, he refused the ceremonial parts and accepted the work. For 2 years he served on the Reconstruction and Atrocity Review Council, where his particular gift for recognizing when law started dressing revenge in decent language proved useful and infuriating in equal measure. Reporters called him a hero, veterans called him either brave or traitor, depending on which names from the war they carried closest to the bone. Elias himself called the whole thing an expensive way to remain able to look in a mirror. S's fate became stranger. Still, she could not remain a simple detainee once the ruling came, yet release in the ordinary sense was impossible. Too many wanted her dead. Too many others wanted to use her. She chose against almost everyone's advice. Not exile to some hidden moon or witness protection architecture under a false face, but service on the archive reconciliation mission, the Joint Human Surrey forensic program tasked with reconstructing the true chain of command, cultural losses, and civilian disappearances from the final war years. If I vanish, she said in her statement, then everyone gets to turn me back into whatever shape is easiest for them. I am tired of being useful only as a symbol. It was a dangerous choice, but by then, dangerous choices had become the only honest currency left between her and the universe. The relationship between her and Elias remained the part storytellers ruined most. They wanted immediate romance because history makes people impatient with slower truths. The real thing was harder earned. They spent months in working rooms arguing over archive language, testimony standards, and whether memory should be curated toward healing or left jagged enough to remain trustworthy. They learned each other's grief by collision first, then by repetition, then by the strange, fragile mercy that grows when two people have already seen the worst ideological versions of one another and still keep returning to the same table. Love, when it came, did not arrive like rescue. It arrived like recognition, surviving after every simpler interpretation had been burned away. The universe found that scandalous in its own sentimental way, not because human men and alien women had never loved before, they had often enough to born novelists, but because this case offended something deeper. She had been meant to die by humans. He had chosen otherwise, and instead of producing only political disaster, that choice had exposed a lie, changed law, preserved truth, and then, most infuriatingly to cynics everywhere, made room for an impossible tenderness to exist afterward without erasing any of the blood that came before it. Years later, when children studied the Mars interruption and the Vera Review civic history modules, the lesson was never framed as romance. It was framed as law under pressure. Yet at the archive garden on Luna, where the names of the dead from both sides were finally recorded together without false equivalence and without political redaction, there stood a smaller inscription off to one side, added not by the state but by anonymous workers who had built the wall in the night. It did not mention love. It did not mention destiny. It said only this: one man refused a convenient death. The universe had to become more honest after that. That was the true shock, not merely that Elias Ward spared Sail Vera, but that his choice forced an entire civilization, and then many others, to confront the possibility that mercy, when rooted in truth instead of innocence, can be more destabilizing than execution and more powerful than revenge.